Tom. We are so excited to have you here. We are making an amazing dinner, Three Sisters chili and cornbread, one of my favorites from the summer. So I hope that you are ready in your kitchen to cook alongside us. If you have any questions, you can just throw them in the chat, send us a comment. Chef Tom is a fountain of wisdom and here to answer all of your cooking questions. So we are excited to get started.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another cooking class. Today we're going to do the Three Sisters chilies and the cornbread, just like Johanna said. I'm hoping that the folks that actually made the spanakopita, it came out well and you enjoyed it. I know my wife and I did that night, so hopefully you'll get to it as well. Three Sisters chili. Let's start with the name. The reason it's called Three Sisters chili is it's a traditional in Native American cultures, or at least some of them, to have grown corn, beans, and squash in a mound together. The beans would climb on the corn, the squash would grow around the corn, and so they became the Three Sisters, and they're the three main ingredients in this chili that we're going to make. To that end, I did actually get a butternut squash, which honestly, this time of year, I don't usually do winter squash. If you don't want to do winter squash this time of year, I often will do sweet potatoes instead, or yams. They work really well as well. But it kind of doesn't work with the name Three Sisters chili. At that point, it's not really Three Sisters. But that said, the taste is still there. So we're going to start off by peeling this, seeding it. We'll put that aside. After we do that, we'll actually dice the onion and we'll go from there. Peeling a butternut's never fun. They're tough and they're not easy to do. I actually usually do it in two parts. I will take the top off, cut the bottom off, the part that's got all the seeds, this smaller portion. And then this portion, I usually just will peel with a knife. You can also do it with a peeler. If your peeler is good, it can work well. If your peeler is not great, it can be a little hard. But the idea is you just want to get off that tough skin, whichever way works easier for you. In this case, the peeler seems to be working very well, so I would say go ahead and use that if you have it. But like I said, if you want to just do it with a knife, you certainly can do it that way. I do it either way, depending on my mood. Sometimes the size, sometimes it's just a matter of the size of the butternut. This is easy to hold in my hand. It's a small one. When they're really large, that makes it a little bit more cumbersome and a little bit more difficult to hold in your hand while you're trying to peel it. I'm going to do the whole thing. And so we're going to just really quickly here peel it. You know, a lot of times when I do cooking classes in other venues, or, you know, like they do with television cooking shows, there's the, you know, they'll do 2 seconds of it. And then the next thing you know, it's all peeled and done and sitting there waiting for the person to cook it. Well, I'm not doing the magic of television here, so you get to see it live. So let's continue here. Shouldn't take too much longer. If people have any questions about anything, this recipe, or even anything else in regards to food, feel free. I'll answer the best I can. No guarantees.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about freezing the spanakopita. In the end, we ate it all. It was delicious. But I'm wondering about freezing it and heating up. And we did make a little triangle, which we froze. And yeah. I decided last minute now to use sweet potato, since my daughter likes that better than butternut squash. And I'm wondering how much you recommend to use.
I'd say a couple cups worth once you've peeled, you know, if you have, again, depending on the size of the sweet potato. You know, if they're medium-sized sweet potatoes, maybe 2 of them. You know, a couple, 2-3 cups worth is about right, in my opinion. But ultimately, really, it's about your taste. In terms of freezing the spanakopita, the triangles freeze great. So that's actually one of the nice parts about doing the triangles. They just freeze raw. So before you even cook it, you can just throw it into the freezer and then throw it into the oven when you want to heat it, to serve. So that works out very well. Once it's baked, it's a little trickier to do. And I honestly, I don't have that much experience doing it once it's baked and then freezing it at that point. Honestly, I think at that point I'd probably just eat it sooner than later because frozen cooked phyllo dough won't do as well. But as I said, if it's not been baked beforehand, you can throw it right in the freezer and then just, I would say, give it 24 hours to defrost if it's a whole pie like that. If it's just the small triangles, you could put those directly into the oven.
We got a question about that. I read that you can microwave the butternut squash before peeling to make it easier to peel. Does that do anything to the taste, in your opinion?
I have no idea. It might actually do it because, look, like all vegetables are composed with lots of water. What the microwave does, it basically excites the water molecules and heats them so that it'll steam internally. That may very well help push the skin to the side and make it easier to peel. Honestly, I've never done it. Most professional kitchens that I work in, when you're peeling a case of butternut, you're not going to be throwing each one into microwaves. And while I'm sure they exist, I've never worked with a large commercial microwave before. That said, I would give it a try. If it works, even better. Because that's sometimes the biggest problem with butternut squash is just peeling the things. I know that for some people, there's a film oftentimes on butternut squash, a stickiness that you get on your hands that also can be very irritating to people. So if that's the case, I would recommend wearing gloves when you do it. I know my daughter actually has that issue. So when she does butternut squash, she'll just put on a pair of gloves before she goes ahead and peels it. And that keeps that stickiness and that film from forming directly on your hands. Anything else? Hopefully these are actually answering your questions. So the problem with one of these types of Zoom cooking classes is I have no idea about reactions from any of you folks. So I often just feel like I'm talking to myself, which is never a good thing.
Chef Tom, I want to let you know that you're getting a lot of love on Instagram right now.
That's nice.
You have some big fans there.
Oh, that's awfully sweet. All right. So right now I have a bowl of butternut squash here. Okay. So you saw it for the person who asked me about the sweet potato. This would be a good amount of sweet potato butternut squash. If I were to have a really large butternut squash, like they often are, in the middle of winter, I oftentimes will just do a half a butternut squash, put the rest in the refrigerator, use it for something else, unless I really want to make that large a batch of chili, which the nice part about chili is it freezes beautifully. So if you do make a large batch and you don't eat it all, take it, freeze it in, whatever size portion makes sense to you guys. Invariably, I know some of this will wind up in my freezer because it's only myself and my wife. And this is a fairly large batch for just two of us. So, invariably, I will end up throwing some of it in the freezer. So cutting onions. I did this last time. I didn't say anything about it. So let me go over that a little bit. To dice an onion, you might have seen how I peeled it. I cut off the top, the bottom, cut it in half, and then peel it off. Once that's done, I will take it and lay it down flat. This is the root end in the back. And then I just proceed to make slices depending on how large I want the dice to be. So that varies. In this case, it's about a quarter inch dice. The other one I did the other day was much finer. Once I do that, I go 90 degrees and just slice it like that. And the last little bit I'll just chop up. And it kind of works very nicely every time. At this point, I'm going to start turning the oven on. I'm going to put a little bit extra onion in. My onion was a little bit on the larger side. And personally, I love onions, so it's rare that it could actually be too much onion, in my opinion, for much of this. So we've got an onion diced. While this is going on, I turned on the Dutch oven, so that will start heating up. I will add some olive oil to it. And I will also peel a couple cloves of garlic because we'll be putting that in as well. You can start the onion and then add the garlic in a little bit later, so you can just do it that way. I will often personally start things before I have things totally prepped up, but I also know that I know myself and how quickly I can prep things. So my recommendation is to many people, have everything laid out beforehand and then start cooking it, as opposed to doing it the way I'm doing it now.
What's the oven temperature that we should preheat to, Chef Tom?
Excuse me?
Do we have a temperature to preheat the oven?
No, I'm just turning it on just to get it hot. It's always nice to put hot oil into a hot pan. So this has been on now for about a minute or so. So I'm going to add about a tablespoon of oil. I'm never that exact. I don't measure out oil. But at the same time, I try and use a minimal amount. Most things don't need too much oil. So I am just peeling the garlic right now. As you might have seen, I smashed it a little bit, and that's just to help get the skin off. So these are particularly oily garlic, so the skin's not wanting to come off so easily. I'll get back to that in a minute. In the meantime, let's put the onion in. All right, so the onion is started.
We really hear that sizzle.
Good. And I'm just going to quickly chop this garlic, and I'll throw that right in the pan as well with the onions and let them fry. Now, I went over my own recipes in the cookbook, and I have a little addendum to what was written there. And the way I'd written it, it was to add everything, once you saute the onions and the garlic, to take everything else and add it in all together. Slight caveat to that, and that is that I would actually fry the spices for a moment after I fried the onions and the garlic, just to bring out the flavor of the spices a little bit more.
Maybe onions.
All right. So I just put the garlic in there. We'll fry that for a few. And we'll just do that. And in the meantime, I'm just going to take one moment to clean up some of this mess. The advantage of living in the country and not the city is I can put everything into a bucket for my compost and just throw it in the backyard. Well, okay, into a pile in the backyard. Otherwise, it gets a little bit messy back there. While that's frying, I'm going to take about half a green pepper, and I'm going to dice that up as well. If you want to put the whole green pepper in, that's fine too. You can also use red pepper if you don't care for green pepper. Also, I have a jalapeno here, which I'm also going to dice up. Now, the jalapeno I'm going to mince. A trick for jalapenos when you're slicing it. A lot of people just cut it in half and scoop the seeds out. The way I like to do it is I will just take the jalapeno, slice one side, and then just proceed to slice 4 slices off of it all. You never have to touch the seeds at all. And then you've got the inside here, which you just go ahead and discard. And that way you don't really have to touch the inside, the seeds, and the place where it's the spiciest. So now I'm just going to slice these jalapenos very thin and turn them 90 degrees and mince them. So I'm sure you've heard these terms, mince, dice. There's a couple other specific French terms, and they're all about how large you do it. So a mince, they basically say it's about 1/8 of an inch dice or even smaller. Regular dice, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch there, you usually, you can be a little bit more specific in that. But you can see that's the jalapeno right there. I think you can see it. And then I'm going to dice a green pepper. And we'll put this in for a few moments and let this also saute before we add in the beans and the remaining ingredients as well. So
I'm just going to share. I just opened a bag of dried diced jalapeno chilies, which I had bought from Savory Spice. So I'm excited to open up and try them. It says soak in water, so I just put a little in water.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, just know yourself and your family's spice level. That's always the tricky part. That's the problem. Fresh jalapenos are great, but out of all the chilies that are out there, they probably vary the most. I've had jalapenos which tasted almost like green peppers, And then I've had some jalapenos where I've taken a bite of it and just started crying almost immediately because it was that spicy. I mean, hiccups and everything. And unfortunately, the only way you can tell how spicy a jalapeno is by trying it. So it makes it really tricky. And I've unfortunately had the occasions where I've made something, assumed the jalapeno was the usual relatively mild batch, and lo and behold, it was a little spicier than anticipated. So be careful. That's all I can say. If you're brave and you feel like tasting your jalapenos, I say go ahead. But that's that I will leave to everybody's discretion how they do it. So I'm sauteing this. They're just starting to turn a little golden, which is very nice. It's what you want. All right. I'm going to put in the jalapeno and the pepper at this point. I'll let that fry also for like another minute. And then we'll start getting the spices together. We'll put those in. And again, things like chilies, that's really do it to your taste. Everybody has different tolerances for how spicy they like things. And remember one thing, I would say go to the lowest common denominator. It's always easy to add spice, really hard to take it out once it's in there. So that's why I have an array of hot sauces for myself, because I love it spicy and my wife does not. So this way we can both eat at the same time. We don't have to make 2 separate batches of something. All right. So I'm going to put in some salt. And again, towards the end of the meal, it's never a bad idea to test for salt or whatever you're.
Hi, Tom. Chef Tom, Eliab would like to say hello.
Hi. I'm seeing you. Hi.
We have another special hello from someone from your summer kitchen. Esteban says, "What's up, Chef Tom?"
Say hi for me. All right, so I'm taking this off the stove so you can try and see what it looks like. So I don't know how clear it is, but at this point, the onions are starting to turn a little bit of color. The peppers and the jalapeno have sauteed for a minute. I'm going to add some spices in now. All right. So I'm going to start off with a little chili powder. Now, the chili powder I use straight chili powder. It's not the blended chili powder that most people buy. I like it straight, and I kind of make my own blend, as it were. Usually, chili powder that you buy that's called chili powder is really a blend of chilies, ground chilies, cumin, salt, garlic powder, and oregano. And as you see, all those things are going into this as is. So what I just put in some oregano. I'm about to put in some cumin. Now we're just going to saute this for another moment here. Should start to smell nice and aromatic. And while that's cooking, I'm going to open the cans that I have. I have some canned tomato here, crushed tomato. That said, if you don't have crushed and you have diced or you have puree, honestly, I use whatever I have available at any given time. I bought some canned beans. Rarely do I use canned beans. I usually make my own and freeze them, but sometimes it's nice to have canned beans around too, which I always keep. I decided on 2 different beans. I just like variety, get a little different texture that way. And in this case, I'm going to add the liquid from the beans as well. I'm not going to drain them, but in the recipe where it says to add 1 cup water or stock, that's where I would adjust that accordingly. If you're adding the liquid from the beans, canned beans.
What type of beans are you using, Tom?
All right. So at this point, the spices have sauteed for a bit. I'm going to add in the butternut squash.
So Chef Tom, what type of beans are you using?
In this case, I'm using black beans and I've got kidney beans.
Okay. And can you just recap the things that are in the pot so far?
Excuse me?
Can you just recap for us the things that are in the pot so far?
So at this point, we got the olive oil in the pan. We have the onions, the garlic, the green pepper, the jalapeno. Now, and then the spices, the cumin, chili powder, oregano. I just put in the 2 different types of beans with the liquid. And now I'm going to add in the tomato puree, or in this case, crushed tomato. All right. And now here's where it's a little tricky. You're looking for a stew-like consistency as opposed to a soup-like consistency, which really just means how much liquid you're adding in. So judge it accordingly. It shouldn't be you don't want it soupy, but you don't want it so thick that it starts to burn on the bottom either. So at this point, I've got this in. I'm going to grab some frozen corn. Now, these days, it's very interesting going to the supermarket. I usually, in the past, I would go to 3 or 4 different supermarkets to get what I wanted. And these days, given life the way it is, I pick my one supermarket for the week. I go there, I buy everything I can. And in some cases, they don't have everything we want. But yeah, we just have to make do. Honestly, we still have more foods available to us than most of the world on a regular basis. So can't feel too horrible about the occasional running out of something.
What would you say about using the whey from, if anyone made cheese this morning from our DIY videos, throwing that in?
They could. I might not. I mean, well, for one thing, I would say, depending on if anybody's a vegan, then you definitely don't want to use it. So there's that caveat. The only other reason that I might not, and honestly, I'm not sure about this as I'm saying it, is shelf life. Because you're adding in a dairy product, it will shorten the shelf life of this a little bit. But on the other hand, if you're eating it all within a couple days or you're freezing it pretty shortly thereafter, then I wouldn't worry about it. And I don't think that's really a critical thing one way or the other. So you certainly can use the whey as a substitute for some of that water or stock. So at this point, everything's in here. I'm adding the corn in as well. So that was about 2 cups.
Adrian, you can also keep your whey, and if you want to use it for a mordant for natural dyeing next week, it doesn't even need to be refrigerated.
I've got about 24 ounces of whey.
So if you want to, I would say keep it out of the fridge, and it's fine to use for dyeing.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that is great to use for great use of whey, is fruit trees. Now, depending on where you are, that may be something that's useful or not. All right. So at this point, everything is in here. I'm going to turn the heat down, and at this point, I put the cover on, and essentially, you're just going to have to let it cook for about a half hour. This gives you the time to make the cornbread in between, which is always nice. So before I start the cornbread, a couple things. One of the things about chili for me, and one of my favorite things about eating chili like this, is the garnishes as much as it is the actual chili itself. So to that end, I love having a little bit of, let's say, minced red onion or scallion or something along those lines. A little diced red pepper is nice to go on top of it. I've done olives, cheese, grated cheese, sour cream, cilantro, diced avocado is always nice. So there's a lot of different ways of garnishing it, and that's where you can make it really personal for everybody. And everybody can personalize their own chili that way. You can put out hot sauces, so everybody can put, whoever wants additional spice can do that. So while it's cooking, I will usually just go ahead and start setting up little bowls of the garnish for myself. And that way there's little extras to put onto it, and it adds a nice contrast of flavors and textures to it as well. Personally, I very much like texture as part of my food. If everything is that same texture, somehow it's just not as pleasant for me. So I cook with texture in mind as much as I do taste and color. And that's the other thing. I like to cook with color. I think that if you end up with a wide variety of colors on your plate, that usually is a good indication you're getting a wide variety of different foods as well, which is always a good thing. Periodically check your chili, make sure it's not sticking. If you need to turn it down a little bit, you can. At a certain point, I will turn it way, way down to the very lowest setting and just let it cook. So here we're dicing a little bit of red pepper. I diced a little bit of red onion. And you don't need much. I mean, it's, a couple tablespoons per person is usually does the trick for things of this nature. I mean, that's all most people want. On the other hand, if somebody wants more, do what works for you. So I'm just going to set this up on a small plate. And that way it'll just be available. All right. So I'm just going to make a little assortment here of various garnishes to be used later on. Any questions at this point? I will take no as a good answer. All right. I'm just going to put this frozen corn away so that I don't let it defrost on me. One other ingredient on the list for the chili, and that is cilantro. And cilantro I add in at the very, very end. So just before serving it, I will add some into the chili itself. That said, I will also leave a little bit on for garnishing after the fact too. I happen to be very much, I love cilantro, so it's rare that it could be too much for me. If you happen to be one of those unlucky people that just tastes like soap, I'm sorry for you. But I get it, and yeah, there's not much you can do if you happen to be one of those people. So,
Tom, would you say just leave it out, or
don't worry about
something else in?
Fine, Yeah. There are some people for whom it tastes like soap. I'm not one of them, so I can't empathize. I'm sorry, but it's a consistent enough thing that I've heard over the years that, yeah, I believe it. All right.
Are there ingredients that you feel are particularly divisive at camp that you maybe wouldn't use for campers because of that?
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
Do you use cilantro at camp?
Oh, I use a lot of cilantro at camp, and I have to be mindful because every once in a while there's like 2 or 3 people for whom it's just absolutely horrid, and there's no hiding it in a dish. So I really try, and when I use cilantro in something, I try to remember to put some aside without cilantro for those couple people that just detest it. And unfortunately, it really is. It's one of those things that people who don't like it really just do not like. Oh, so there's no fighting that. And so
Okay. We got a question here. If we are baking the cornbread tomorrow, can we mix it all together and then keep it in the fridge covered overnight?
I would say no. You're much better off. So what happens is as soon as liquid interacts with baking powder, which is one of the ingredients in here, it automatically starts the rising process. That has a limited shelf life. So if, for instance, you've ever made pancakes and had extra pancake batter, the next time you cook the pancakes, they tend to come out a lot flatter than the previous time because most of the chemical reaction from the baking soda has already expired. So I would recommend you can mix your dry ingredients. And seeing as how the wet ingredients are all of 2 things, it's either yogurt, buttermilk, and eggs, I would say just do that at the very last minute. You'll come up with a much nicer product. So that's what I would do. Now, the other thing that I do personally is the recipe that I gave everybody for cornbread that's in the book. It's a great recipe. It's a wonderful recipe for 4 people. I personally don't think that leftover cornbread's great. So I tend to, when I make it for myself, I make a half batch. Just that way I eat the whole thing and there's really almost no leftovers. And I'm much happier than that way. I'd rather make a second batch for leftovers than to eat the same one. But then again, I'm a little picky. I admit it. It's why I got into this to begin with. So if you're fine with cornbread the next day, then go ahead. Please just make the whole thing. All right. Yeah. Oh. All right. So mine just started sticking a little bit. So I'm going to turn it way down, the chili. And we're just going to let it simmer for a while here. Now, the other thing, I put in frozen corn kernels. The other thing that I also happen to really like in chili is if you can find it in the store, which I couldn't this time for whatever reason, is what's called pozole or hominy. It's essentially corn that you take the outer hard shell off of, and then it's cooked. So it's the same type of corn that's used to make tortillas, tamales, that type of thing. In that case, it's crushed up and ground and made into a dough. I just happen to like the taste of it better, and I like the mouthfeel, the chew of it. It has a little bit chewier as opposed to corn kernels, which have a different type of a bite. So while that's going on, we will start doing the cornbread. Now, as soon as I start doing the cornbread, the first thing I will do is turn the oven on to 375 to preheat the oven. Now, when you're preheating the oven, you want to put the pan that the cornbread is going to go into in the oven right away. You want to take it out and put your cornbread into a hot cast iron pan, ideally. If you don't have a cast iron pan, you have a small like 8x8 pan, you can use that as well. I would say preheat that as well. Then as soon as it's preheated, when the oven says it's at 375, your batter should already be made. You'll put some oil into the pan itself, pour the batter in, and it should sizzle right away. And that gives the cornbread a really nice crust on the outside, a little crunchy, a little browning, and it's a really wonderful thing. Years ago, I ended up getting this cast iron pan that's made specifically for cornbread. So I don't know how well you can see it, but essentially it has little slots here. Each one sort of looks like an ear of corn. It's got little grid here. So essentially they look like tiny little corn cobs. The nice part about doing it on this is if you like the crust from the cornbread, lots of crust. And so that's why I personally love to use this. This here makes enough. I can get cornbread, a half a batch of the recipe that I gave you is enough to fill this. If I want to do the whole recipe, I would put 2 of these in the oven at the same time.
It also just seems really fun to have cornbread in the shape of corn.
Oh, absolutely. It's a blast. Would I go out and get it just for that? No. I happen to get lucky and I happen to find it. And so I end up with not something I would normally get. So just one. I tend not to get kitchen equipment that has only one use. This is one of the few exceptions that I do.
And we set the oven to 375?
375, yep. Now, I'm not going to do this all right now because honestly, and I will tell you all too, cornbread's best when it comes right out of the oven. You don't really want to let it sit for a while or anything. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to measure out the dry ingredients. I'll measure out the wet ingredients. I'm going to put them aside. Last minute, and that's unfortunately after we part ways here, you'll just mix it up. And then just like as I said, you'll take the hot pan out of the oven, put a tablespoon or 2 of oil in it, enough to coat it very nicely. Try and make sure you get around the sides of it too, because that way when the cornbread rises, it'll get crispy too. And then put it in and bake it for a half hour. That half hour is for the 8-inch cast iron. If you're using that, if you happen to have one of those small corn ones, that would be less time. That's 15, 20 minutes. You can also do this in muffin tins. And it would be the same thing. Put your muffin tin in the oven, get it hot, put oil in, pour your batter in. When you pour your batter in, expect it's going to rise. So you want to fill it no more than about 2/3 because it will start to rise. And then put it in the oven. That'll probably take about 20, 25 minutes, somewhere in that vicinity. You can tell that it's done. The outside edges should be having a nice kind of golden brown, and it should look firm to the touch. If you have a doubt, put a toothpick or a fine knife in there. If it comes out clean, you're good. Okay.
Question, I have a 10-inch cast iron. Is it okay to use that and just have it in there for a little less?
Yeah, you may need to reduce the time. It'll come out thinner, obviously, because it just won't be as bulky, but it should work just fine as well. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Cornmeal, start with that. So like I said, I'm reducing this recipe, so I'm cutting it in half. So just be aware of that as I say what I'm. So in this case, the recipe calls for 1.5 cups cornmeal. So it's 3/4 of a cup for doing a half recipe, okay? So I don't mean to throw you off. Hopefully you have the recipe in front of you. So that takes care of the cornmeal. And this one's a relatively fine cornmeal as opposed to a coarse one like you would use for polenta or such. And then, in this case, a 1/4 cup of just flour. You can also use whole wheat flour. It works as well. It would normally be for the full batch. It would be a 1/2 cup. Sorry. So this cornbread recipe, unlike many cornbread recipes, actually has more corn flour than it does wheat flour, which makes it nice and corny, and just gives it a really nice flavor. So it should be about 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. Now, this is one of the few times when I actually do look at a recipe and I try and follow a recipe fairly verbatim. Baking is one thing and cooking is another. With baking, you do need a certain degree of precision, but even there, it's a lot more flexibility than we think there is oftentimes. So I have the corn, the flour, the baking powder. I'm going to put in a little bit of salt, a pinch of salt, and then a little bit of sugar. Now, sugar is really to taste. If you like a sweet cornbread, put in a little bit more. If you don't want it too sweet, put in a little bit less. This is about 1 tablespoon that I'm putting in for this amount here. Okay, so. And I use yogurt for this recipe, primarily because I rarely keep buttermilk in the house, and yet I always have yogurt. So yogurt works great. The acid in it interacts with the baking powder, so you get a nice fluffy cornbread. That's also the buttermilk works in the same way. Somebody have a question?
Is there a particular type of sugar that you recommend?
No, not really. I would tend to use a light sugar as opposed to a brown sugar. And you can even leave it out. It's not absolutely required if you'd rather do that. You could use agave. I've never used it, honestly. I would put that, if I were to do that, I would put that in with the liquid ingredients, though, and then just add it in at the last possible moment. The other nice part is honestly, I use a fork to mix everything up. So at this point, this is the dry ingredients. So I just set the dry ingredients into a bowl and leave it at that. So I'll put that aside. And then essentially the wet ingredients, I will just put it all into a measuring cup. In this case, this is a 4 cup. So it will easily fit the 1.25 cups of yogurt and the eggs. Stir it up really well. Pour it into your cornmeal. Stir that up. Now, one thing about quick breads, that's cornbreads, banana breads, anything that's a not yeasted bread, you don't want to overstir it. When you stir it and when you knead bread, that develops the gluten. That gives the bread a nice crust and also those little holes and holds the structure of the bread. It also gives it a nice chew. But with quick breads, you're not looking for that same kind of a chew. So if you mix it too much, you end up overdeveloping the gluten at that point, and the product you get is not nearly as tender as it could be. So that holds for cornbread, banana muffins, any kind of muffins like that. Pancakes are the same thing. Again, they're about the same type of thing, baking powder and flours and liquids put in. So at this point,
Do you have a
just check.
suggestion, Chef Tom, a suggestion for someone who wants to make their cornbread non-dairy?
Yes. Okay. So with that, you can get, I would probably say in this case, non-dairy yogurt would work just fine as a substitution. If it's non-dairy, that's fine. If you're not looking to put egg in it as well. I mean, I've done gluten-free vegan cornbreads. The bottom line is they're going to definitely be a lot denser. The egg definitely gives it some more airiness and loft as well. And also egg is great because it helps bind things together. And that's one of the properties that you lose when you're not using real egg. But that said, you can still make it. It's something you may want to play around with and check other recipes. There may actually be, and I'll admit it, other recipes that are better for a gluten-free option than the one that I've got written down here. That's one of the caveats. But as far as dairy-free, I would just say go ahead and use one of the other types of yogurts. There's a lot of different dairy-free yogurts available out there these days. So I would say just go ahead and do that. All right.
And what about sunflower or avocado oil?
Instead of what? To use in replacing what?
Do you want to jump in there? Out of olive oil for olive oil.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. No, you can use any kind of oil. I happen to like olive oil a lot, so I tend to use it a lot. The other oil that I keep around is I have sunflower oil here. But yeah, I mean, use whatever. Avocado oil you can use for sure. Personally, it's so expensive. I would tend to use that more as a finishing oil, just like a really nice extra virgin olive oil. You use that at the very end because you get that flavor that way. Whereas if you put it in initially, you'll lose that flavor. But it still works in terms of an oil. You can use margarine, any kind of fat really will work. Honestly, if I make it, sometimes I make something like this and there'll be meat in it or something. And sometimes I use bacon fat because you save everything. I know we're a kosher camp. We don't do bacon, but I'm not. So anyway.
That doesn't happen in the Eden Village kitchen, only in Chef Tom's home kitchen.
Never. No, we wouldn't do that. So at this point, it really is down to waiting for it to cook. And I don't know how much you want to watch me do anything at this point, because at this point, it really is a matter of just giving it time. This is where I didn't do the magic of television, so sorry. So I can't show you exactly what it looks like, but it's not going to look any different, really. Chilies like this, you can cook them long and slow for quite a while. The longer you cook it, the more mushy the sweet potato or the butternut would be. So I tend to try and not cook it to the point where everything's falling apart. As I said, I do like some texture, so that's what I do. I have some cilantro here, which I would have chopped up. I'll put that in at the very end. I'll probably chop a little bit more for the garnish. I oftentimes like to grate up a little bit of either cheddar or Mexican queso fresco or pepper jack cheese and toss that on at the top. And that's for garnish as well. Yeah, so I think
Did we lose the chef?
We lost Chef Tom there. He's just really excited to eat his chili right now. Is anyone who's making this in their kitchen at home? Can they tell us what it smells like right now? It smells really good.
Do you know how long we cooked the cornbread?
The cornbread, I think we said half an hour.
Half an hour, okay.
And
I think he also said 20 minutes at one point, but it might depend on your pan.
yeah, I think he said a shorter amount of time for one of those smaller pans if you have muffin tins or a cornbread corn pan. All right, he's back. Bring Chef Tom back on here. One moment. All right, Chef Tom, are you back with us? Oh, you are muted, Chef Tom. We aren't hearing you because you're muted.
all right, is that better?
There we go. We had a question. So we had a question about the cook time for the cornbread.
Yes. Sorry. What's the question?
How long in the cast iron or like 8x8 pan?
So I would say that give that about a half hour. And when I say a half hour, I usually put my timer at 25 minutes for whatever I'm baking. I'll always reduce the time on my timer. I'd rather check it early, and if I need to take it out early, I can. If I need to give it another 5 minutes, then I can give it another 5 minutes that way. So I will often do it that way.
How are you checking it? What are you?
I open up the oven, and a lot of it's by color. So you're looking for the edges to be kind of golden brown. And then, like I said, if you are in doubt, if it should also look fairly solid. It shouldn't look liquidy or anything like that. And if you're in doubt, take a small paring knife or even a toothpick and stick it in there. And if it comes out clean, it's done. If it's still wet, give it another couple minutes to cook. Same thing applies for the muffins or like the 10 by 10. If you're doing it, the 10-inch diameter cast iron, I would say reduce that timing down to 18 minutes and check it, and then give it another couple minutes if you need to. It's always better to give it a little less time and have to put it back in for another minute or two than the other way around. Okay. So, anybody else with any questions?
How long would you cook it for, like a normal pan that's not cast iron?
About the same amount of time. You won't. The only real difference is it will be the texture of the cornbread. You won't get that the same kind of crispy edges that you would otherwise. But it still works as a good cornbread. So you can definitely use it, do it in a different pan as well. Anybody else?
I have a couple questions. One, how do you like to clean your cast iron pans?
I am surprisingly not too fussy about them. That's the one thing I've always loved about cast iron pans. That said, I primarily do it with just a steel wool, just steel scrubby, not steel wool, not soapy steel wool. If it's particularly dirty or particularly greasy, I will do a little bit of soap and sponge and just wash it out. And then the last thing I do is I always dry my cast irons on the burner. And that certainly will kill anything that might happen to be there. That's why I don't worry so much about the soap using it. But sometimes if it's particularly greasy, I will use a little bit of soap on it. What I've always loved about cast irons, though, is that you can always bring them back. They can get abused, horribly abused. And with a little bit of time and a little bit of love, you can bring them back so that they're really wonderful and smooth. And I have one pan here that I've had for many years. It's actually, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a sloped side. So I use this as an omelet pan. And as long as I get the heat right, can't start it in this type of pan cold, like you could in a Teflon, and it's going to slide right out. But if the temperature's just right, a little bit of oil, this works as well as any Teflon pan that I've ever had. And it's cast iron, and I don't have to worry about Teflon, which is not one of my favorite things. So yeah, I'm pretty. I don't baby my cast irons too much, And the way in terms of finishing a cast iron, or if you ever want to bring it back because it's gotten rusted or whatever, the method that I use is fairly simple, a little bit dangerous though. You would take your cast iron, you put it on the burner, and you pour in 2-3 tablespoons of oil, and then maybe about 1/4 cup of kosher salt. And you want kosher salt because of the large crystals. I heat that up on the burner. When the salt starts to turn golden, turn off the heat, and then with a towel, rag, clean, that you don't mind throwing away at the end, very carefully wad it up, and then just gently use that to scrub the cast iron. The salt acts as an abrasive and takes off anything that's there, and then the oil just seeps in to help seal it. And then after that, just clean it out entirely, wipe it out, give it a quick rinse, and oftentimes that's a great way to bring back a cast iron pan. Sometimes it requires more than one treatment if it's really bad. But I've been able to bring back cast iron pans that have looked rusty and absolutely horrible and made them work really nicely.
I also
Any
have
other
a question.
questions?
Oh, can I ask something about next week's lesson?
Yeah.
Next week's
Yeah, in fact, actually, I'm glad you're asking. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was looking up the Monday recipe. By the way, I'm coming to all of these. Okay.
Okay.
And hopefully my daughter will come to a lot of it too.
Yeah.
But,
I have no idea who I'm talking to, but I'm glad.
I'm Adrienne. Yeah. Last year you made my daughter a delicious birthday cake for her birthday, which was, it's great.
Good.
But anyhow, So I saw it's 4 to 6 cups roasted vegetables for the, I forget what it is, a pasta thing. And
Yep.
I'm assuming we should have that done beforehand, right?
Yeah, it'll probably expedite things a little bit more. That said, that part that class may run a little long just because of the nature of what it is. But you know, most vegetables you can roast in about 20 minutes, assuming the oven's been on and you can get that done. And some of it will just determine, you know, based on the size of how large you cut it. So if you cut cauliflower into large florets, well, it's going to take longer. If you cut it into smaller, it's going to take less time in the oven. That said, if you're trying to cook with me, it may not be the worst of ideas of going ahead and pre-roasting some of that. The other thing that I wanted to add for that class specifically is everybody should have some cheesecloth, because we'll need it not just for the ricotta, but we're also going to we're going to put some of that cheese away for paneer, and we will be doing that as well on that class, because then we will use the paneer on that Wednesday class. Okay.
Also, for the milk, we usually don't have milk in our home, but I'm gonna get some.
Okay.
Today we had whole milk for the cheese making.
Yep.
Is it okay to have like a 2% though? Would
Oh,
that
yeah.
Okay.
The difference is your yield may be a little bit less and it won't be quite as rich, but that's really about the only difference. But absolutely, it works well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And so, sorry, one last thing. So that gallon is for the paneer and the ricotta.
Yeah, I mean, I think 1 gallon should be enough for both. I don't think we really want to do 2 gallons. I mean, if you want to make a gallon's worth of paneer, the nice part about paneer freezes beautifully. So once it's pressed, because that's one of the things we'll be doing, is we'll be putting it into the cheesecloth and then putting a weight on it and letting it sit overnight, in this case 2 days, is that once it's in that stage and it's pressed and you have a nice block, you can go ahead, take that, wrap it up, throw it in the freezer, and then when you want to use it, just take it out and use it accordingly. It's also not a bad way of taking, you know, for instance, you have way too much milk and it's starting to get way too close to its expiration date, make some paneer, press it, throw it in the freezer until next time. So, anybody else, please? Well, if not, then I think we'll sign off for today.
Let's.
I'd love to hear how your cornbread turns out, how your chili turns out. Anybody did anybody make the spanakopita, and how did that turn out for you guys? I see 1 thumbs up, so that's great.
It was amazing. We loved it.
Awesome. Well, good. I'm really glad.
And I might make it
Really amazing.
Yeah, I might make it Sunday with kale for our new rabbi. We'll see.
There you go.
Spanakopita and Greek salad were delicious. How long does the spanakopita last in the fridge?
A few days. I wouldn't do it. I certainly wouldn't do it a full week, 3-4 days. I mean, I had mine on Monday. I think I'm having it leftovers for tomorrow night with my wife. So that'll be 3 days in the fridge. Friday, it's still good. You know, I wouldn't let it last too long, mostly because, again, it's a texture thing and the phyllo dough will just get kind of softer and softer. In terms of reheating it, I would probably put it into an oven. Again, about a 350-degree oven. I would say wrap it in foil initially, give that about 10 or 15 minutes in the oven, and then take the cover off and give it another 5 or so minutes in the oven to crisp up the phyllo dough. And that should come out fast. All right.
All right, let's give it up for Chef Tom. Thank you so much for teaching us how to make chili and cornbread.
Enjoy. I'm sorry I don't get to cook for you guys this summer.
Thank you.
It's a bummer, but I hope you guys are having
Thank
a good time
you.
anyway.
We're having a lot of fun being joined by folks on Facebook and Instagram, also cooking alongside. So thank you, Chef Tom. We will see you all on Monday for our next food tour.
My pleasure. Take care, guys. Be well.